Saturday, May 14th, 1892. A frightened young man runs into the town of Pound, Virginia, looking for Jemima Harris and George Francisco. The young man is 15-year-old John Harris Mullins, son of Ira and Louisa Mullins. When he finally locates them, he falls screaming and sobbing into the arms of Jemima Harris. Between the sobs, tears, and the gasping for air, he tells them a horror story about a shooting on the mountain near the Pound Gap. John said, quote, "When the shooting started, I began to run and saw Wilson stagger and one of the horses fall." Unquote. John Mullins had one of his suspenders broken from a shot that had just missed his body. Upon examination, it was discovered that John had multiple bullet holes in his clothing, and it became clear just how narrowly he had escaped with his life. John stated that he had no idea who had attacked them because as soon as the shooting began, he had started to run. He also said that he thought he had run for about a half a mile before the shooting stopped, but he had kept running because he thought they might come after him. Jemima Harris immediately started out for Pound Gap. Along the way, she stopped at the house of Floyd Branham to have his wife Elizabeth go with her to the top of the mountain. The two women were the first to arrive on the scene. At about 10 a.m. that morning, John Mullins, along with Jemima's son, Greenberry Harris, and 6 others, had left the home of his uncle, Wilson Mullins, at the mouth of Cane Creek in Kentucky, headed towards Pound, Virginia. The party had included John's uncle, Wilson Mullins, who was leading the group on horseback, John's mother and father, Louisa and Ira Mullins, who were riding in a wagon with his cousin Mindy. Ira's handyman, John Chappell, was driving the wagon. John and Greenberry had been walking behind it, and John's aunt, Jane Mullins, was following the group on horseback. Along the way, they had stopped at a store and left Mindy, whose full name was Amarinda, with her maternal grandmother. Mindy did not want to go with her grandmother, but her mother, Jane, was insistent that she stay with her grandmother. Eventually, Wilson bribed Mindy into going with her grandmother by buying her a can of store-bought peaches. At about 1 p.m., the party had crossed through the Pound Gap and started down the mountain. As they drew near a large pile of rocks that sat beside the road, gunshots rang out. Robert Mullins, who lived about 3 miles from the Pound Gap on the Virginia side of the mountain, and John Bentley, who lived in Kentucky, were also traveling that day in opposite directions. They had arrived at the scene at about 2:30 p.m., shortly after Jemima and Elizabeth. What they found was a scene straight out of the Police Gazette. A grieving mother crying over her dead son and another woman trying to comfort her. Additionally, there were 4 other bodies surrounding a wagon which was still hitched to 2 dead horses. The 2 men quickly took control of the crime scene in order to preserve it, and Bentley, who was a magistrate, started an investigation of the scene. For those that do not wish to hear about the crime scene, we have provided a timestamp in the description box so that you may skip to the next section of the story. That section will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mrs. Mullins was found under the wagon, shot in the chest. Additionally, it was well known that Louisa often wore a money belt, but her dress had been raised over her head, and the belt had been stolen. Ira Mullins was a quadriplegic and had been riding in the back of the wagon. He had received 8 bullets in the head, shoulders, and thighs. His body was found still laying in the wagon. Ira's handyman, John Chappell, had received 6 shots. Although he had been driving the wagon and setting beside Luanza. There is no record of where his body was found. However, in an interesting historical note, it is reported that Mr. Chappelle was an African American and was buried along with the rest of the party from the massacre. His gravesite and theirs can be found under a historical marker at the Potter Cemetery, which is also known as the Murdered Man's Cemetery in Jenkins, Kentucky. Greenberry Harris, who was also in his teens, was found behind the wagon. It is thought that he and Wilson were the first to fall, and that at least one of the shots he received may have been meant for John. He received 2 bullets in the head and 1 in the heart. Wilson Mullins had received 1 bullet in his heart and was laying ahead of the wagon. There was no sign of his horse. Both horses that had been pulling the wagon had been shot and killed. The wagon itself was riddled with bullet holes. When they had arrived at the site, John Bentley and Robert Mullins had questioned Elizabeth Branham. She had told them about John Harris Mullins and the story that he had told to Jemima. In addition to being a magistrate, John Bentley owned the little store where 2 hours earlier Wilson had bought the can of peaches for his daughter. Knowing the full makeup of the party, John Bentley immediately became concerned. Elizabeth had said nothing about Jane, and her body and her horse were missing. The 2 men immediately began searching for Jane, ranging up and down the mountain from the scene of the crime. Yet the body of Jane Mullins and her horse were nowhere to be found. The alarm spread fast, and many people were on the scene within an hour or 2. With each new arrival, John Bentley and Robert Mullins inquired about Jane. No one reported seeing or passing her on their way to the crime scene. In addition, none of them had seen evidence to indicate the possibility of an injured person leaving the road. 3 hours later, Ira's sister, Amoda Jane Mullins, rode into Cane Creek, now the Camden section of Jenkins, Kentucky, screaming, "Everyone is dead but me." She had first told everyone in Camden that when the shooting started, she had escaped by riding hard back up the mountain headed for home. Her story about this would change several times in the coming days, weeks, and months. The first time it would change was that evening. Jane Mullins came back from Kentucky with friends and family and arrived at the crime scene at about 6 p.m., just as John Bentley and Robert Mullins were finishing up their investigation. One of the first things that John Bentley did as part of his investigation was to question Jane about where she had been and why he nor anyone else had encountered her on the road. What's more, Jane went on to give several people conflicting stories about what she was doing during the time frame in question. Jane's whereabouts and her activities during the 4 hours after the shooting remain a mystery to this day. For several days after the massacre, during the funeral and wake, Jane told multiple people that she, quote, did not know who the shooters were, unquote. One of the witnesses called for the defense testified that Jane had told her, quote, when the shooting was going on, I was so scared I would not have known your husband Matt if he had been there, unquote. Then on May 19th, Jane Mullins would once again change her story. She began telling everyone that Doc Taylor and the Fleming brothers were the shooters, and that she had recognized one of their voices. She also stated that she had tried to save Luanza by pulling her under the wagon. She went on to say that when a pause in the gunfire came, she had yelled out, quote, boys, for the Lord's sake, don't shoot anymore. You've killed them all. Let me stay here with them till someone finds us, unquote. She then said that the men yelled at her 3 or 4 times, cursing and threatening her. Jane said that she thought one of the men sounded like Calvin Fleming. Another may have been Doc Taylor, and that a third man, who may have been Heenan Fleming, had asked the others to let her go. Then one of the other men cursed her and yelled, quote, "Take to the road or we'll kill you too," unquote. In court, the counsel for the defense asked why she had not told this story from the start. Jane replied that she had feared for her life as the Fleming brothers were her neighbors. We will cover this line of questioning and other evidence in more detail in our follow-up series, which will be titled, quote, "The Killing Rock, The Untold Story," unquote. The Fleming brothers had been running the widow Vanover's farm, as Heenan had married Catherine Vanover. In addition, it has also been said that Calvin Fleming was engaged to another of the Vanover daughters. Ira's cabin, that Jane and her husband Wilson Mullins had been living in, was on land owned by the widow Vanover. What's more, Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor was a frequent visitor at the Vanover farm, as he had been good friends with Henry Vanover before his murder. Doc had been testifying on the widow Vanover's behalf in court, as after Henry Vanover's murder, his widow faced over 100 lawsuits over the land that she and Henry had owned, including one from Ira Mullins. It is also of interest to note that at least one source tells us that Ira had been in Kentucky that week due to a court case over land. Friday, June 3rd, 1892. Evidence found at the scene of the crime and John Bentley's investigation pointed to two suspects. But only one, Henry Clay Adams, would be indicted on this date. Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor and the Fleming brothers, Calvin and Samuel Heenan, would also be indicted, based solely upon the word of Amoda Jane Mullins.
Thank you for watching our video. Thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Please like, subscribe, and share below. Also hit the bell for notifications of future videos. And once again, be sure to leave us a "Hey y'all" in the comment section below.